The stage lights were never supposed to feel this cold. To millions watching around the world, Celine Tam looked like a miracle wrapped in innocence, a tiny girl with a giant voice, smiling beneath thunderous applause while judges fought tears behind polished desks. But behind the standing ovations and viral performances lived a childhood quietly shaped by pressure, sacrifice, exhaustion, and a loneliness too heavy for someone so young to fully understand. Long before the cameras arrived, music had already become more than a dream inside her home. It became expectation, identity, survival. Every note she sang carried the invisible weight of proving that talent could change an ordinary family's life forever. And as the world celebrated the rise of a child star, few noticed the emotional cost slowly building behind her bright expression. Because fame arrives differently for children. It does not ask whether they are emotionally ready to carry the hopes of strangers. And somewhere between the applause and the silence afterward, one question quietly remained. What happens to a child when the world falls in love with a version of her she may never truly escape? Long before television audiences discovered Celine Tam beneath the blinding lights of a global stage, music already filled the narrow spaces of her childhood like a second heartbeat. Inside the family apartment in Hong Kong, melodies drifted through hallways before sunrise, echoing against quiet walls while the rest of the city still slept beneath pale morning haze. Her father listened carefully each time she sang, hearing something extraordinary hidden inside a voice still far too young to understand the weight adults were beginning to attach to it. To him, the gift felt undeniable. To Celine, it simply felt normal. At first, the rehearsals resembled ordinary family moments. Small microphones rested on tables beside unfinished meals. Songs played repeatedly from old speakers while she memorized lyrics with the obedient concentration of a child eager to please the people she loved most. But over time, those moments hardened into routine. Afternoons disappeared into vocal practice. Weekends became performances inside shopping centers, restaurants, and talent contests where strangers stared with fascinated expressions before erupting into applause loud enough to overwhelm the room. The applause changed everything. Adults leaned closer whenever she entered a stage. Judges smiled with visible surprise. Relatives spoke about her future with growing certainty, as though destiny itself had already chosen her path long before she understood what choice truly meant. In photographs, she smiled brightly beside trophies almost larger than her arms, yet behind those carefully captured moments lived the quiet exhaustion of a child learning how deeply approval could depend on performance. Some nights, after rehearsals finally ended, silence settled heavily across the apartment. The city lights outside flickered through curtains while homework remained unfinished beside cold cups of tea. Other children spent evenings chasing games across playgrounds or laughing loudly through ordinary childhood arguments. Celine spent hers replaying melodies repeatedly, correcting tiny mistakes adults barely noticed. Each imperfect note carried invisible emotional consequences. Each success brought temporary relief. Without realizing it, she slowly began connecting love with achievement. The transformation happened quietly enough that nobody immediately recognized its emotional cost. Family encouragement blurred into expectation. Compliments became standards she felt responsible for protecting. Even during celebrations, a nervous tension lingered beneath the surface, fragile and persistent, like glass waiting for pressure strong enough to fracture it. She learned to bow politely after performances even when exhaustion burned behind her eyes. She learned to smile through nervousness. Most painfully, she learned that people looked happiest when she sounded flawless. And because she was still only a child, she mistook that reaction for safety. The deeper music entered her identity, the more difficult ordinary childhood became to recognize. Cameras appeared more often. Conversations increasingly revolved around possibility, competition, improvement, and sacrifice. Adults described her future in grand emotional language, while she quietly carried fears she could not yet explain aloud. Somewhere beneath the praise lived an uncertainty growing larger each year, a silent question forming inside moments nobody else noticed. If her voice one day failed, If the applause disappeared, if the crowd stopped smiling, what remained of the little girl beneath the performance? Late at night, after another exhausting rehearsal finally ended, Celine stood alone beside the apartment window while distant traffic glowed beneath the dark Hong Kong skyline. Behind her, sheet music covered the table like unfinished promises. Ahead of her stretched a future already moving faster than childhood itself. And somewhere deep inside that growing silence, the fear quietly began taking shape. What if being loved had already become something she needed to earn? The theater lights inside America's Got Talent felt almost unreal from the center of the stage. Rows of strangers disappeared into darkness beyond the cameras while towering screens flickered with anticipation high above the audience. Producers moved quickly through narrow backstage corridors, speaking in hushed urgency, adjusting microphones, rehearsing introductions, preparing another emotional moment for millions watching from living rooms across the world. Amid the machinery of television spectacles stood Celine Tam, small, smiling, and outwardly calm, her hands folded carefully in front of her as though still trying to appear smaller than the pressure surrounding her. The moment carried the illusion of magic. To audiences, she looked fearless. But fear had already become part of the performance. Backstage, adults spoke around her constantly. Instructions blended with encouragement. Stage managers smiled reassuringly while cameras searched her face for nervousness, innocence, vulnerability. The emotional ingredients television transformed into unforgettable stories. Even before she sang a single note, the narrative had already begun forming around her. She was not simply a contestant anymore. She was becoming a symbol. Then the music started. The first notes rose softly into the enormous theater, and within seconds, the atmosphere changed completely. Conversation stopped. Judges leaned forward. The audience watched with stunned disbelief as a voice far larger than her small frame filled the room with aching precision. Tears appeared almost instantly in the crowd. Expressions softened. Phones lifted into the air. Somewhere behind the cameras, producers recognized the exact emotional reaction they had hoped to capture. And when the performance ended, the applause felt endless. For one brief moment, the entire world seemed to fall in love with her at once. Clips spread rapidly across social media platforms. Headlines described her as extraordinary, angelic, unforgettable. Millions of strangers watched her performances repeatedly, emotionally attached not only to her talent, but to the innocence they believed she represented. In a world increasingly cynical and loud, Celine Tam became a rare emotional refuge, a child whose voice momentarily made people feel hopeful again. But fame rarely arrives gently for children. Behind the standing ovations existed exhaustion no audience could see. Hotel rooms replaced familiar routines. Rehearsals grew longer. Interviews became constant. Producers searched for emotional reactions during every interaction, shaping television moments from fragments of vulnerability. Each performance now carried expectations larger than the last. Success no longer felt surprising. It became required. The deeper public admiration grew, the more dangerous imperfection began to feel. Inside dressing rooms illuminated by harsh vanity lights, she quietly absorbed the emotional atmosphere surrounding her. Adults celebrated every viral moment with increasing excitement. Family members recognized opportunities expanding rapidly ahead. Online audiences analyzed performances with obsessive intensity, praising her one moment while comparing her to others the next. Even compliments carried pressure now. Every standing ovation created another impossible standard she feared failing to reach again. And because she was still only a child, she lacked the emotional language to explain the anxiety forming beneath her cheerful public image. Applause became comforting in the same way silence became frightening. Whenever audiences erupted with praise, the fear briefly disappeared. For a few shining seconds, she felt safe, wanted, valuable. But afterward, alone in quiet backstage corridors or dark hotel rooms far from home, uncertainty returned stronger than before. The world loved her now. The world celebrated her now. But what happened if one day it stopped? Television demanded emotional maturity she had never been given time to develop naturally. She learned how to smile through exhaustion, how to remain polite under pressure, how to appear endlessly grateful while carrying emotional burdens too complex for childhood to fully process. Her innocence became part of the entertainment itself, something audiences emotionally consumed without recognizing the psychological cost attached to preserving it. And as the competition intensified week after week, another realization slowly emerged beneath the applause. The love of millions could arrive overnight, which meant it could disappear just as quickly. Late after another performance, while the theater lights dimmed one section at a time, Celine stood silently near the empty stage listening to distant crew members dismantling pieces of the spectacle that had briefly made her feel untouchable. The applause was already fading into memory, and for the first time, the possibility of losing it terrified her more than failure itself. After the explosion of global attention surrounding America's Got Talent, Celine Tam's life no longer moved with the rhythm of ordinary childhood. It moved according to schedules, appearances, rehearsals, interviews, flights, recordings, and expectations that seemed to multiply faster than anyone around her could fully control. Every room she entered already carried assumptions about who she was supposed to be before she even spoke. To the public, she had become something larger than herself. Not simply a singer, a symbol. Fans described her as pure hope in difficult times. Television hosts introduced her with emotional admiration normally reserved for legendary performers decades older. Social media transformed brief moments of innocence into endlessly replayed clips consumed by millions of strangers who projected their own emotions onto her smiling face. Adults cried while watching her sing. Children looked up to her. Parents admired her discipline. The world built a version of Celine Tam that felt almost untouchable. And slowly, dangerously, she began feeling responsible for protecting it. Inside brightly lit studios and crowded backstage hallways, people constantly reminded her to stay cheerful, humble, grateful, inspiring. The expectations sounded harmless individually, but together they formed an invisible emotional prison around a child still trying to understand herself. Every smile carried pressure now. Every public appearance required emotional precision. Even ordinary childhood frustration felt forbidden beneath the weight of so many watching eyes. Because symbols were not allowed to break. At school, normal interactions had become strangely fragile. Other children recognized her instantly. Teachers treated her differently. Conversations often revolved around performances, fame, or television moments instead of the ordinary emotional chaos most children quietly shared with one another. Isolation arrived subtly, hidden beneath admiration. The more famous she became, the fewer places remained where she could simply exist without being observed, evaluated, or emotionally interpreted. Loneliness followed her quietly through crowded rooms. Late at night inside hotel suites or family apartments filled with rehearsal schedules and travel plans, silence often felt heavier than applause. While the world celebrated her extraordinary life, she privately carried exhaustion she could not easily express aloud. Vulnerability felt dangerous now. Sadness risked disappointing people. Fear threatened the image everyone depended upon emotionally. So she learned to hide discomfort beneath politeness polished far beyond her age. Even at home, the emotional atmosphere grew increasingly complicated. Her family still loved her deeply. That truth remained real. But ambition and sacrifice had become intertwined so tightly with her success that separating affection from expectation no longer felt simple. Every achievement opened larger possibilities. Every opportunity carried financial hope, emotional investment, and years of sacrifice attached to it. Conversations about the future grew more intense. Rehearsals became more demanding. Mistakes felt heavier. Without intending to, the people closest to her had begun building their own dreams around her voice. And Celine felt it. She felt it in the anxious silence after imperfect performances, in the relief adults displayed after successful appearances, in the emotional urgency surrounding every career decision being made around her before she fully understood adulthood itself. Failure no longer seemed personal. It felt collective, as though disappointing others had become more frightening than disappointing herself. Somewhere beneath the fame, the applause, and the carefully protected public image, a painful uncertainty quietly deepened inside her. Did she still love singing freely? Or had music become the language through which everyone else's hopes now spoke? One evening after another exhausting rehearsal, she sat silently beneath dim apartment lighting while unfinished sheet music covered the table nearby. Outside, the city moved endlessly through glowing streets and distant traffic sounds. Inside, the silence around her carried a question nobody wanted to ask aloud. Was this still her dream anymore? Or had she slowly become responsible for carrying everyone else's? As the years moved forward, subtle changes began reshaping the world around Celine Tam in ways both invisible and emotionally devastating. Childhood, once preserved inside bright television moments and viral performances, no longer stood still for the comfort of audiences who wanted her to remain frozen in innocence forever. Her voice matured gradually. Her appearance changed softly with age. The tiny child who once amazed millions with impossible purity slowly became an adolescent navigating uncertainty beneath relentless public observation. And the entertainment world noticed everything. Inside online comment sections and social media discussions, admiration slowly evolved into comparison. Audiences who once celebrated her unconditionally now measured every performance against memories of who she used to be. Some insisted she had changed. Others searched endlessly for the emotional magic of earlier years, as though childhood itself had been the product they originally fell in love with. The internet rarely understood the cruelty hidden inside nostalgia. For child performers, growing older can feel like betrayal. Celine sensed it long before anyone spoke it aloud. Backstage before performances, nervousness no longer resembled ordinary stage fright. It became something heavier, the fear of failing expectations built by millions of strangers who still remembered the little girl from television clips watched years earlier. Every note now carried emotional consequences. Every public appearance felt like an unspoken test she could never fully prepare for. The applause still came, but it sounded different now. Less innocent, more demanding. Success stopped feeling joyful. It began feeling necessary. While other children privately stumbled through insecurity, awkwardness, emotional confusion, and identity changes, Celine experienced those same fragile transformations beneath public scrutiny. Cameras continued documenting her growth while audiences unconsciously compared reality against the preserved memory of who she once had been. Adolescence, already emotionally disorienting for most young people, became psychologically exhausting under constant observation. Even silence started feeling dangerous. Whenever public attention faded temporarily, anxiety quietly filled the empty space left behind. The internet moved quickly. New talents emerged constantly. Viral fame vanished without warning every single day. Celine understood that reality even before adulthood fully arrived. If people stopped talking about her, stopped sharing performances, stopped celebrating her voice, what remained afterward? The fear of irrelevance settled deeply into her emotional world. At home, the atmosphere surrounding her career had also changed. Years earlier, music represented hope and possibility. Now it carried weight, sacrifice, consequence. Her family remained emotionally close, bound together by years of shared struggle and ambition, yet tension quietly existed beneath their support for one another. Financial pressures, career decisions, travel demands, and public expectations had slowly reshaped family life around performance schedules and opportunity. Dreams had become responsibility. Some evenings after rehearsals, exhaustion filled the apartment more heavily than conversation. Her parents still encouraged her gently, but beneath their optimism lived unspoken fear about maintaining momentum in an industry that rarely waited patiently for anyone. Opportunities felt temporary. Success felt fragile. Every decision carried emotional stakes larger than before. And Celine absorbed all of it. She learned to smile automatically even when anxiety tightened inside her chest. She learned how to remain gracious while carrying invisible emotional fatigue. Most painfully, She learned how to protect the version of herself the world preferred seeing, even as her real identity quietly evolved underneath. But identities cannot remain frozen forever. Late one evening after another performance, she sat alone in a dim dressing room illuminated only by pale mirror lights reflecting across scattered makeup brushes and abandoned water bottles. Outside the closed door, distant applause still echoed faintly through theater hallways. Yet inside the silence surrounding her, another truth had begun emerging with terrifying clarity. The world had fallen in love with her childhood, and childhood was slowly disappearing. Behind her carefully practiced smile lived a question growing impossible to escape. What happens to a child star when the very thing audiences loved most no longer exists? The tragedy of child fame rarely announces itself all at once. It does not always arrive through scandal, collapse, or public breakdown. More often, it emerges slowly, almost invisibly, through emotional exhaustion that accumulates year after year beneath carefully maintained smiles. It reveals itself in missed childhood memories, identity confusion, loneliness hidden behind applause, and the quiet realization that growing up publicly can fracture a person long before they fully understand themselves. For Celine Tam, that realization deepened gradually as adolescence gave way to emotional maturity. The world that once celebrated her endlessly had already begun moving forward. Online attention shifted constantly toward newer performers, younger talents, fresher emotional stories. Viral clips that once spread across millions of screens faded beneath endless waves of new content arriving every hour. Audiences who once watched her performances repeatedly now consumed newer sensations with the same emotional intensity they had once reserved for her. Fame, which once felt permanent during childhood, revealed its frightening instability with brutal clarity. The silence afterward felt unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. There had been a time when every performance generated headlines, reactions, interviews, admiration. Notifications flooded endlessly across screens. Comments described her as unforgettable, extraordinary, inspirational. Then gradually, without any dramatic moment marking the transition, the noise became quieter. Public fascination softened. Conversation slowed. Attention drifted elsewhere. But emotional dependence on validation does not disappear as quickly as public interest does. Inside that growing silence, uncertainty expanded into spaces applause once filled. Some nights, scrolling through social media became emotionally unbearable. Comparisons appeared constantly. New singers received the same overwhelming praise audiences once gave her. Comment sections analyzed her appearance, voice, maturity, and performances with casual cruelty disguised as opinion. Some people insisted she had changed too much. Others claimed she no longer possessed the magic she once carried effortlessly as a child. The internet that had once elevated her now quietly contributed to her insecurity. And because she had spent so many formative years being emotionally rewarded for performing, separating self-worth from achievement became painfully difficult. Late one evening, after recording vocals alone inside a dim studio illuminated by soft equipment lights, she removed her headphones slowly while silence settled across the room. Outside the glass booth, nobody applauded. No audience waited. No cameras searched for emotion. For the first time in years, the moment belonged only to her. And standing quietly between the fading memory of childhood fame and the uncertain reality of adulthood, one devastating question lingered more painfully than ever before. If the spotlight disappeared forever, would she finally discover who she truly was, or realize she had never been allowed to become that person at all? By the time the brightest years of early fame began dissolving into memory, the story of Celine Tam no longer resembled the simple inspirational narrative audiences once consumed so easily. The viral performances still existed online. The standing ovations still echoed through old clips replayed endlessly by strangers searching for nostalgia. But behind those preserved moments stood someone entirely more complicated than the world had ever fully understood. Not merely a gifted child, a young woman shaped by pressure, visibility, expectation, and emotional survival. The transformation happened slowly enough that many people never noticed it happening at all. Years earlier, applause had defined the emotional rhythm of her life. Success determined confidence. Public admiration created temporary safety from fear and uncertainty. But adulthood brought an uncomfortable clarity impossible to avoid forever. Fame had never truly protected her from loneliness. It had only hidden it beneath noise bright enough to distract millions from seeing it clearly. Now, in quieter moments away from cameras and massive audiences, she began confronting parts of herself that performance had buried for years. The silence felt unfamiliar at first, then necessary. Inside recording studios illuminated by soft evening light, music gradually stopped feeling like obligation alone. The desperate pressure to impress strangers weakened little by little, replaced by something quieter and more personal. Singing no longer existed solely for judges, producers, headlines, or viral reactions. For the first time in years, it began belonging to her again. Not completely, but enough to matter. That emotional shift did not erase the scars childhood fame had left behind. Some wounds remained deeply embedded beneath the surface. The instinct to seek validation still lingered inside ordinary moments. Compliments still carried disproportionate emotional weight. Criticism still reached places inside her shaped long ago by perfectionism and fear. Years spent growing up publicly had permanently altered the way she understood herself. Former child stars often carry invisible echoes long after audiences move on. The fear of becoming irrelevant, the anxiety of being forgotten, the unsettling feeling that personal value must always be earned through achievement. Celine carried those echoes too. Even during peaceful moments, uncertainty sometimes returned without warning. Walking through crowded cities where nobody recognized her could feel strangely comforting one day and emotionally painful the next. Part of her longed for privacy. Another part still instinctively searched for the validation fame once provided so easily. Healing rarely moves in straight lines for people whose identities formed beneath public observation, especially when childhood itself became inseparable from performance. Yet survival had quietly become its own kind of triumph. There were no dramatic declarations announcing emotional freedom. No perfectly cinematic recovery waiting at the end of her story. Real healing appeared smaller than that. Slower. More fragile. It revealed itself in moments where she allowed herself to exist imperfectly without panic. In moments where silence no longer felt like failure. In moments where music created peace instead of pressure. For the first time, life gradually began shifting away from the expectations of strangers, toward possibility, toward self-discovery, toward the painful but necessary process of becoming a person beyond the image audiences once adored. At home, the emotional atmosphere surrounding her family softened with time as well. Years of ambition and sacrifice had left complicated memories behind, yet beneath everything remained genuine love, imperfect, human, exhausted, but real. Distance from constant public pressure allowed quieter truths to emerge between them. They had all survived something emotionally consuming together. None of them escaped unchanged. And perhaps that understanding itself carried a strange kind of healing. One evening, long after another recording session ended, Celine remained alone inside the studio while the final notes of a song faded softly into silence. No cameras documented the moment. No audience waited outside. The room glowed dimly beneath scattered equipment lights, while rain tapped gently against distant windows beyond the city skyline. For years, stages had defined her existence. Now silence did. And within that silence, something unfamiliar finally began taking shape. Not the identity built by fame, not the child preserved inside viral memories, not the simple strangers emotionally projected onto television screens, but something far quieter and infinitely more difficult to discover. Herself. Yet even then, uncertainty still lingered softly at the edge of everything. Because the emotional consequences of growing up in public never disappear completely. The world may remember the performances forever. Audiences may continue replaying the image of the smiling child beneath dazzling stage lights. But the real story continues long after the applause ends. And somewhere beyond the fading echoes of fame, beyond the expectations that once shaped her entire world, one final question still remains unanswered in the darkness. When the stage lights disappear completely, who will Celine Tam choose to become when nobody else is watching anymore?